So a warm Columbia welcome to you all. I'm John Coatsworth, the Provost of the university. When my cage is left unlocked, I'm an economic historian, and I have a strong interest in the topic that you're going to be discussing this evening, this policy forum on affordable housing. This is the first of 3 days of activities on urban topics here at Columbia. It's an especially appropriate place to be discussing urban affairs because we're in a big city, a big global city, but also because when we did a rather clumsy survey of faculty websites across the university some years back, we discovered over 440 faculty at Columbia University who claim to do something having to do with cities or urban life or the metropolitan area of New York. It's amazing. This city, and even this university, has one of the greatest concentrations of urban specialists in the world. So it kind of stops me from wondering, makes me wonder, why our city is such a mess? when so many of us have been working on solving those problems. But maybe we'll learn something about that tonight as well. The next 2 days, we also have the Frontiers of Urban Economics Conference that will bring together nearly 100 PhD students from across the U.S. and overseas to learn about the research frontiers of that field, with presentations by many of the most distinguished researchers on cities in the world. I'm particularly pleased to be able to join you for tonight's Policy Forum on Affordable Housing, because as a former dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, here known affectionately as SIPA, I spent a great deal of time working with Esther Fuchs and many other faculty on the development of programs that addressed urban problems. I know the value of bringing together very distinguished public servants and leading academic researchers. We have a great panel of both this evening. First, we are very happy to welcome an exceptionally distinguished public servant, Carl Weisbrod, who has served various mayors reaching back to John Lindsay. He is currently serving as the chairman of the New York City Planning Commission with considerable insight and input into the de Blasio administration's affordable housing policies, which, as you know, have been the subject of considerable and intense press scrutiny these last weeks. We also have Gilles Duranton, who is the dean's chair in real estate at Wharton, co-editor of the Journal of Urban Economics, and the incoming president of the Urban Economics Association. Welcome. We have Ingrid Gould Ellen, who is the Paulette Goddard Professor of Urban Policy and Planning and Director of the Furman Institute for Real Estate and Public Policy at NYU. And finally, we have the indefatigable, brilliant, and creative Don Davis, who's chairman of our economics department, who will moderate. The issues dealt with tonight are foundational for our city. Rent is the typical New Yorker's largest expenditure, and the very success of our city is pushing rents to new heights. While everyone feels the pinch of high rents, especially the faculty at Columbia because they email me all the time, those with the least means have the least ability to cope. So while the subject of tonight's policy forum is affordable housing, we see that it is not only a dollars and cents issue. Dollars and cents matter, of course, and it would be bad policy that does not pay them close heed. But the policies are also about, urban policies are also about what type of city we hope to create and ultimately about who we are. So thank you for coming. I'm looking forward to an exciting panel. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, John. We're very lucky to have John participating this evening. So we're going to do a couple of things. We'll be having each of the speakers speak for about 15, 20 minutes. We'll be starting with Carl, then going to Gilles, and then to Ingrid. One thing that you should see is that you have index cards on your seats. If you would like to ask a question, it would be great if you would write it on the index card, and shortly before the three panelists finish, we'll gather the cards and we'll use those to seed the conversation afterwards. So I'm going to first turn to Carl Weisbrod.
Well, thank you very much, and let me just say what a pleasure it is for me to be back here at Columbia, a school that I taught at as an adjunct for many, many years. Can everyone hear me in the back? Is that okay? And I was perhaps one of the 440 faculty members or attenuated faculty members who thought that he knew something about urban life and urban development, and now maybe you're down to 339, I don't know. But let me just start by with a disagreement about one thing that Provost Coatsworth said, which is, why are cities such a mess? And I would say this is quite the contrary. This is sort of like a golden age for cities in not only in this country but around the world. And it's not to say we don't have lots of challenges, affordable housing certainly being among them, but to some extent those are the challenges of success. And New York City right now is certainly in better shape than I can ever remember it in my lifetime. Our population is at an all-time high. It's at 8.4 million people. We project it will grow to 9 million people by 2040. We have more jobs in the city than we've ever had, 4.2 million at last count. And our economy, which used to be almost entirely dependent on Wall Street and the ups and downs of the financial markets, is now more diversified than it's ever been. Finance is still obviously important for New York, but it is much less critical than it used to be. And we have a diversified economy and a powerful urban economy that is literally the envy of the world. So I think it's important as we discuss affordable housing, which really is a crisis, to keep that in mind. And also to now embrace something that the Provost said. I think the issue of affordable housing is not simply an issue of housing, but an issue of equity, and an issue that certainly Mayor de Blasio feels very, very strongly about. And addressing the affordable housing crisis is certainly one important way of addressing the crisis of equity and the growing gap between rich and poor, which is certainly evident in this city, but again, evident in major economies, major urban centers, and in the West, and in all developed countries, with the possible exception of Japan, around the world. And now let me talk a little about affordable housing, where we are, and what the City of New York is doing about it. I'm going to try to do this in three parts. One, what the crisis is, what the overall city's response is, and then our sweet spot, what we're doing at the Department of City Planning to address one or several elements of the housing crisis. And again, let me start by saying how the housing crisis, in a sense, is different from the housing crisis that New York faced when I started out in urban life in the Lindsay administration and later in the Koch administration. We face a housing crisis of scarcity. In the 1960s, New York City faced a housing crisis of abandonment. We had lots of land. We had lots of housing that was literally abandoned and vacant. We had a shrinking population, and Mayor Koch, to his everlasting credit, probably he claimed the single biggest and best thing he ever did was to come up with a comprehensive housing program that addressed abandonment, addressed and revitalized vacant housing, and had vacant land on which to build. The city in the 1980s was just coming out of the fiscal crisis of the 70s. It didn't have much money, but it did have a lot of land. It did have abandoned housing, and it could build. That's not the case today. We don't have vacant land, and we don't have abandoned housing. We have a crisis of scarcity, and that crisis is reflected by a substantial gap between the rents that market rate rents that are charged and the incomes that people have and can afford to pay. Over the past decade, average rents rose by more than 10%, while wages have stagnated, as we well know. 55% of renter households in New York City are rent burdened. That means they're paying more than a third of their gross household income on rent. 30% are extremely rent burdened. And 2/3 of New York City households are renters. That's much higher than in most cities in this country, and certainly much higher than we see in our analog cities, which also face these crises, such as London. And we aren't producing as much housing as we'd like to. We have a very limited supply of affordable housing. I give enormous credit to the Bloomberg administration which produced over 12 years 165,000 units of affordable housing, and yet the total number of affordable units in the city actually shrunk in those 12 years because units were slipping out of the affordable housing market through a variety of different means. And the pressure on affordable housing is growing because of the success of the city in large measure. Our population is growing. We have had 230,000 new residents who have arrived in New York since 2010, and 600,000, as I've indicated, more are expected to come by 2040. So we have a huge, huge crisis and gap between supply and demand. Another way to look at this is to look at the fact that the gap between the housing that people can afford and the supply of housing that's affordable to that population. We have somewhat less than 500,000 units of housing that are affordable for extremely low income and very low income renter households. And the number of those households are close to 1 million. So we have a gap right now of 500,000 units as we speak. And I don't think I have to tell anyone in this room that in addition to the demand that's generated from the high flyers and people of talent that we always wish to attract to the city, we also have every single night in the city of New York in excess of 50,000 people who are sleeping in homeless shelters. 25,000 of them are children, and that's really just totally unacceptable for a civilized society. We talk about the homeless on the street, and that certainly is an issue, but when we think about 50,000 people in a civilized and rich city like New York who are sleeping in homeless shelters, that's really just unacceptable. It should be something that all of us should be up in arms about. So the city, and one of the first things that Mayor de Blasio did when he took office in 2014 was to create what is clearly the most comprehensive, in my view, the most sophisticated housing program in the United States, affordable housing program in the United States, that's at least the rival of the path-setting Mayor Koch program of the 1980s, and in some ways much more sophisticated given the unavailability of vacant land, given the unavailability of abandoned housing. And that program basically has 5 components to it. So one is allocating a unprecedented amount of capital funds to subsidize the preservation and development of new affordable housing. $7.2 billion in New York City capital funds over the next 10 years. And that is twice as much as the Bloomberg administration allocated for affordable housing. And as I said, that was hardly a shabby effort on its part. And it is more than the next 50 cities in the United States combined. So it is a huge commitment to affordable housing at a time when, for the past 30, 40 years, our national government has been, at best, at very best, not contributing more to housing in this country. And in fact, given inflation, given budget cuts and the like, is contributing a lot less. The second thing we are doing is preserving and protecting people who are living in neighborhoods today who are in danger of displacement through a variety of enforcement means. Among others, we are providing free legal services to tenants who are subject to legal harassment and eviction by owners who seek to gentrify neighborhoods and evict the poor. That money is concentrated, and those services are concentrated in areas that the city is looking to revitalize. The third thing we're doing is we recognize we have to increase both density of neighborhoods and provide for more appealing neighborhoods. And so we at the Department of City Planning have been charged with looking at neighborhoods and seeing how we can revitalize those neighborhoods by planning from the ground up rather than from the top down. And let me just talk briefly about what that means. It means that instead of going into a neighborhood and saying, okay, here's what you're going to get, we're just going to rezone this neighborhood, we are working from the ground up with other city agencies in a comprehensive way, engaged with local communities to determine their needs, and not only talk about how we can create more housing, but how we can create healthier, more viable, more livable communities. And that means we recognize not just upzoning, not just creating taller buildings, but by planning in those communities to provide the whole range of public improvements and services that a community needs to be healthy and viable. And we are not simply doing it by making empty promises. We have set aside, in addition to the $7.2 billion in public funds that are being used solely to subsidize housing, we have set aside $1 billion additional capital funds that will be used solely to improve and provide public investments in neighborhoods that we're looking to revitalize. We've committed to revitalizing 15 neighborhoods at the very least. We'll probably do more. We've identified 7 so far. I'll get to that in a bit. We've started working with those communities. It is a slower process, to be sure, but it's because the neighborhoods are wary, neighborhoods are scared. People, for all the concerns that people have about current conditions in neighborhoods, people are naturally skittish about the future, and they are unclear and uncertain and wary about the unknown, and have experienced, many of them, a history of promises that have not been kept over many of the administrations that I've worked in for a variety of reasons, despite good intentions, but partly because business cycles change and budgets change and administrations change and priorities change and the like. And that's why we've set aside money up front to assure that the needed public services are provided, and those services include open space, they include schools, they include a better streetscape, they include better vocational services, they include a host of different services that every healthy community has a right to expect. That is only possible, we believe, because for the first time now in 40 years, I think, the city's capital budget process is being closely implemented in a partnership between the city's Office of Management and Budget and Planning. And so for what a 10-year capital plan should be is a plan. It's not just a financial plan, it's a plan as to how city resources should be allocated, where they should be spent. And before the fiscal crisis of the 1970s, the city's charter actually required city planning and the Office of Management and Budget to do that together. That was lost in the fiscal crisis and is now being reclaimed in a way that provides for much better planning process. The next thing that we're doing, and so we started in seven neighborhoods. The first of those neighborhoods that we have been working in now for 4 years, and that work really did start in the Bloomberg administration, is in East New York, which we just very recently certified into the formal city land use process. That will come to a vote at city planning sometime in January, and then we'll go before the city council in March. And that will be, I think, an indicator of how successful we are being in terms of addressing the issues on a neighborhood level in a responsible, thoughtful way that neighborhoods can embrace. The second thing that we're doing is trying to make housing less expensive to build and to assure that we can do everything we can do to bring our zoning and housing requirements into the modern age. And so we've also just recently launched into the public approval process a comprehensive zoning change called Zoning for Quality and Affordability. The very name makes every community board in the city wary and thinks that we're somehow doing something that is going to destroy their neighborhoods. But in fact, it has a very limited but very important objectives. One thing we're doing is through zoning, through quality and affordability, is slightly expanding building envelopes to make it possible for developers to actually achieve the full development rights that the underlying zoning provides. Our zoning in some areas provide very, very tight building envelopes, and it is often impossible for developers to achieve the full housing development that the underlying zoning suggests and actually authorizes them to get. And that is particularly true because we have on the books right now something called voluntary inclusionary zoning, which gives developers certain incentives if they provide in their buildings affordable housing, that they can build a little more and get a little more market rate units if they provide in a building affordable housing. But under existing building constraints, they can't always do that, even though they want to do that. So one of the things that zoning for quality and affordability will do is make it possible for developers to do that. The second thing that zoning for affordability and quality will do is to enhance the ability and the flexibility to provide senior housing. Our senior population is growing and will grow by 40% between now and 2040, and the needs of seniors are especially acute and varied. So we need everything from seniors who can live independently to seniors who want to be in continuing care retirement communities, of which none exist in New York because we have inappropriate zoning to allow them, and the zoning rules are too complicated to allow them to go forward, to nursing homes, where we have on the books, for example, a requirement that you need a special permit in certain neighborhoods in order to build a nursing home that's separate and apart from all the health permits that you need. And the only reason we have that permit on the books is because 45 years ago, literally half a century ago, there was a nursing home scandal. And like so many things in New York and everywhere else that where government imposes new regulations, the reason for the initial regulation has long expired, and why we continue to have a regulation nobody remembers. So we're trying to make that make it easier to build senior housing. And then the last thing we're doing in terms of zoning for quality and affordability is eliminating parking requirements in neighborhoods that are transit-rich zones for people for affordable and senior housing. The numbers of people who qualify for senior affordable housing and for affordable housing who actually own cars and live near subway stations is, as you can imagine, exceedingly small. And the cost now of building required parking for that population, which doesn't need it and doesn't want it, is exceedingly high. And it's the government basically that ends up paying the cost, since all of the parking spaces are part of an affordable housing project. So we want to eliminate that in transit-rich zones. As someone who runs a Catholic charity senior citizens program and senior housing program told one of our community boards, we have waiting lists of thousands of people seeking senior housing, we have no waiting list for senior parking. And you would think that this was perfectly logical, but the reaction that we've been getting from communities outside of Manhattan has been really quite intense, because those neighborhoods are fearful of somehow being overrun by a massive influx of 75-year-old car owners, and who will be circling the block for weeks on end looking for free parking. So that's a second major issue that we are promoting right now, and a major policy direction for us. And the third that I will just mention briefly is introducing, for the first time in New York, a mandatory inclusionary zoning program where any neighborhood that we rezone for more housing capacity, or any private application that we embrace and approve for that will increase housing capacity, will be required to provide between 25 and 30% of all units as affordable. Actually, not all units, as all of the development rights in that building as affordable. And that if a developer decides, or we decide in a particular neighborhood that a developer should be entitled as of right, if they build a new building, to 25% of all units being affordable, the average monthly rent will be set at roughly 60% on average of the area's median income, which is about $40-something thousand a year for a family of three. However, if a developer, and we direct the developer to provide 30% of as a set aside for affordable housing, as a consequence, the area median income average for those affordable housing units will go up somewhat to roughly 80% of the area's median income, which is roughly $60,000+ for a family of three. And then in certain neighborhoods where we want to assure that market rate housing will go forward, and where the market rate is roughly affordable right now, we are introducing a third option, which is for workforce housing, where developers would have to set aside 30% of their units at 120% of area median income. But those units would not be available for any public subsidy whatsoever. And the goal here is to the goals here are a fewfold. One is to make sure that our public dollars go further. Second, to encourage, wherever we can, economic diversity in neighborhoods. We are great believers that economically diverse neighborhoods are healthy neighborhoods, and this does go to the issue of equity, and there have been certainly several studies that indicate that at the very least, children who grow up in economically diverse neighborhoods will do better than poor children who grow up in economically diverse neighborhoods will do better than children who grow up in just poor neighborhoods. And we want to encourage that. We think that's what New York City is all about, and it's all about diversity. And then the final point I'll make on mandatory inclusionary zoning is that it is another means of our public dollars going further and expecting more from the private sector through a cross-subsidy that will allow those, or require those, who are really doing very, very, very well and are still selling market rate co-ops and condos and rentals at a very healthy profit, to divert some of that profit to help support and help address our housing crisis. So on balance, that's our overall program. A mandatory inclusionary zoning is now also out for public review. That's also going to come before the City Planning Commission in January. We have quite a fall that we're looking forward to. We are actively engaged now in neighborhoods throughout New York City. But we think that all of these are not only important, but are in many ways unprecedented, and certainly with mandatory inclusionary housing, this is the most aggressive by far such program in the United States. So with that, I will stop.
So thank you so much, Carl. I think that's a fascinating opening up of the questions. I noticed that many of you have been so fascinated that you haven't picked up your index cards to start writing questions. And so let me encourage you to begin thinking about that process. And now we'll move on to Gilles Duranton.
Okay, I actually feel very intimidated being among such distinguished New Yorkers. As you can hear from my accent, I was not born in the South Bronx. I'm actually from West Philly, so...
Yes, I'm sure.
Well, that's where I work, at least. So before I unleash quite a lot of negativity, because I'm going to take issues with inclusionary zoning and argue that it's a misled priority, let me say that nonetheless I agree with very much of what the rest of what the Commissioner said. So he's very pro-building. I think that's a great idea. He wants to simplify the zoning code. I think that's a great idea. Doing away with parking requirements in lots of places, that's probably a great idea. So all of those things I'm very, very much in favor. Inclusionary zoning, far less so. So let me give you a few facts, because in order to prepare for that, I had to browse the New York City website, the Wikipedia, and all those things. So 200,000 units of affordable housing have been promised by the incoming administration. I've made some calculation on the basis of a 20% share of affordable housing, but now we hear 25 to 30%. I think that will make just my calculations even worse. So indeed, the median apartment price in Manhattan is about $1 million. That's a very, very large amount of money. That's nearly 20 years of your typical household income here. Put slightly way differently, the median wall apartment is not affordable. At the same time, the New York distribution of income is slightly odd, but not completely out of the ordinary. So New York is actually not very far. New York City as a whole is not very far from the national wealth distributions. It has more rich people, but not a huge amount more. And it has more poor people as well. And I'll come back to that. Manhattan indeed is skewed. Manhattan has a share of households with income 200,000 and more, which is 18%. The national average is between 5 and 6. So Manhattan is different. Manhattan is also different relative to the rest of the US. It is way denser than most of the rest of the US. At the same time, it is only slightly denser than Central Paris. Lots of places in the world are way, way denser than that. At the same time, Brooklyn and the Bronx are only about half as dense, and Queens is about only a third as dense. Staten Island is only 10% the density of Manhattan, so there's lots of space out there. And something that I really found surprising, I mean, some natives of those areas told me it's not that surprising, but some parts of the New Jersey suburbs, like Hoboken, are actually denser than Manhattan, for your information, which I thought was interesting. So let me start with some economic analysis of inclusionary zoning. I find it hard to believe that it's going to increase supply. It's a tax. It's a tax levied on developers and people who do not benefit from those policies. So arguing that a tax is going to raise supply is hard. So that's going to reduce well supply. In turn, we know that when people have to buy something where there is some inclusionary zoning, they are less willing to pay. So that's also reducing, that's also adding a small negative externality. And unfortunately, these are distortions that are going to come on top of lots of other distortions. So as an economist, I know that when you add some distortions to lots more distortions, well, the welfare losses can be unfortunately very large. So I've done a little bit of calculation. So if we take some housing at the fringe of New York City, let's assume a share of land of 30% and 20% of inclusionary zoning units to be mandated. They're going to be sold, that's my assumption, at the cost of construction. So the land is going to be paid by the others. That's already a 7.5% tax. So that's not trivial. You had the small negative externality associated with the fact that people are less willing to live in that sort of environment, so we're reaching 10%. Now, if we think of some nicer parts of Manhattan where the share of land might be more like 60%. I asked some developers last Friday at our annual Will Industry meeting, and they're telling me, 60%. That makes those units way more expensive. And here, in that case, for the non-beneficiaries, that's a 20% well penalty nearly that we're getting. So it means that with a supply elasticity of about 2, which strikes me as reasonable. I mean, there's no great agreement on that. In order to produce 1 unit of affordable housing, it's 2 market units that don't exist. So I find it's a pretty high cost. You may want to do that, but it's a pretty high cost. Then you end up making a gift that is fairly large to people, and that gift, given that we want to spend typically 25 to 30% of our income in housing, if you make a gift that represents more than 50% of their income, not all of it will be fully appreciated. And the little calculation I've done is maybe 75%. So it means that not only you're going to tax others, but the person receiving 100 will value that at only 75. So I don't find it to be great. Then let me make another point and go against what was just argued about the externalities associated with social mixing and diversity. Yes, all else equal, we all like diversity and social mixing, but really it's a large literature, and there's literally one paper that finds something. Okay, it's a better paper, it's a recent paper, but it's one paper in a very, very large literature. Really, this literature has been struggling to find big effects from social mixings. So I'm an economist, yes, I find it more tasteful, more pleasurable. Aesthetically, I would have a preference for that, but given that the cost of that seems to be really high, why should we pay a really high price? Then the other thing that bothers me, and that's the one thing that bothers me most, is we're talking about units that will go for whatever, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000. Big discount relative to my median 1 million price, nonetheless, but we're talking about something that will be affordable not to people at the bottom of the income distribution. That's going to be something for people in whatever the 6th or 7th decile of the income distribution. We're talking about senior police officers. We're talking about reasonably old secondary school teachers. We're talking about personal assistants at Goldman Sachs. These are the people that are going to beneficiate from that. Because not only is it going to be expensive, but then there will be a screening mechanism, and the other landowners or tenants will make sure that the neighbors they get through affordable housing will be the right sort of neighbors. And people are really good at that. So we end up transferring things from people, in making 212,000 and more, not at the very top because they don't really care. They have their penthouse anyway, but people who are like between the 90th and the 95th percentile of the distribution, to redistribute to the 6th or the 7th will decide, really, should we will devote large resources and lots of energies for that? I'm not sure. I'm also uneasy with the notion that there will be some amount of bargaining when you are able to do that, 25, 30%. And I know when things get bargained, some people come on top. These are not always the best people. There are some Donalds, some developers, not the nice Donald that we have here, but some other Donald that actually can make very large fortunes at being really, really good at bargaining with local governments. And I'm not sure this is a good idea. And we may also end up with local corruption, which I find deeply distasteful. So I'm all in favor instead of reasonable rules that people will apply in a systematic way as opposed to things that can be negotiated. Also, what I have Enrico Moretti right in front of me, and also what I find is we know from his work and from work by Ed Glazer that shutting down New York City to newcomers is a pretty large cost to the entire US economy. So he's saying 5, 6, or 7 points of GDP. That's a pretty large cost. So actually, doing something that does not increase well supply, likely will to reduce well supply, well as opposed to focusing all the energies on actually trying to build more is counterproductive. At the same time, I understand why this is happening, because politically this is convenient. That's going to benefit a small minority, and this small minority will be sort of wedded with you politically for a long time. On top of that, many others may still vote for you because they're going to think that they will win with the lottery. You're not really harming the other voters because you end up raising prices. So the other voters are not directly harmed by you, because this is a tax that's being paid by the households that are trying to come here, and the so-called big bad developers. Also, I trust those guys for finding ways not to pay those taxes. So it's economically not a great idea, but politically that's going to be effective. I'm not sure this. So the good news is that maybe this 200,000 objective will not be fulfilled, because Mayor Bloomberg was increasing the stock of housing in this country, and it was about as pro-building as an administration as it ever gets, by about 1% a year. So that's whatever 30,000 units a year, 40,000 units a year. Even with 20% or 25% affordable housing, reaching 200,000 will take a long time. So after all that negativity, what should we do? What should we do instead? So I'm all in favor of building, and indeed, as I mentioned at the beginning, some parts of New York City are not super high density. They could do with more density. And let me be provocative here. Even Manhattan could do with higher density. So the highest density known to mankind was the Kowloon Wall City, in Hong Kong. So if you apply, and people lived, it wasn't great, it was a bit cramped and stuff, but if you were to apply that to the entire Manhattan area, you would be able to host 65 million people. So I'm not arguing for that sort of extreme for sure, but at the moment it's 1.6. So between 1.6 and 65 is actually quite a lot of room, right? So at the same time, I think we need to be realistic, in the sense that you can be as pro-building as you want. So again, Mayor Bloomberg, that was about 1% a year. Hopefully you'll be able to beat that, but 2% would be extraordinary. And 2% during 10 years, that's a 20% increase in the stock. That would be great. At the same time, if you think that demand, even if you think that demand is fairly price elastic, again, let's assume an elasticity of -1, a 20% increase in supply, that's a 20% reduction in prices. 20% reduction in prices is 2 years of price growth between 1998 and 2006. So you can maybe tame price growth, but undoing it will completely, unfortunately, that's not going to happen. So there's building, but there's not only building. We need to think seriously about improving access. A subway line can carry 25,000 people per hour. So that means perhaps about 100,000 households at the other end of the line. If they all will contribute $2 per day, $1 each way going to work, you can sort of justify $1 billion plus sort of expenditure on transportation. You cannot justify the $5 billion of the Second Avenue subway. That's the most expensive piece of public transportation in the entire universe. But there are things that we can think about in terms of transportation, because you can make cities grow by building higher and building more, but also by allowing people to come from further away. I think part of the issue for the city is indeed some city employees may not be greatly paid. But instead of trying to find a way to pay them through affordable housing, which is really complicated and really costly to society, maybe we should just pay them more. If police officers are not paid enough, we should raise their wage. And the property tax is probably a much more efficient instrument. And then, there are all sorts of pie-in-the-sky type of ideas that I'm not convinced by them, but, we need to look at them slightly more seriously. Maybe we should try to reclaim land on the water. This morning, coming from New Jersey, between Newark and here, there's a lot of space that's not very well used, and it's not great, but it's costly, but at the same time, there are swampish sort of areas that, you could flattened them and built on them. I would like to see the numbers. I'm not saying that this is something we should absolutely do, but we should try to think well outside of the box. I'm a business school professor, so I need to say the things I get. I guess, but so I'm optimistic. But there's one aspect of of the policies here that I don't like.
Okay, thank you very much. After the inspiring talk that Carl gave, I'm actually very disappointed with Gilles. We were hoping he was going to be provocative. So our third speaker tonight is Ingrid Gould. She is a professor of urban planning and economics also at NYU. She's the director of the Furman Center, and she's one of the most knowledgeable people on the planet on these topics.
I don't know about that, but I'm very happy to be here. So, and can you all hear me in the back? So I do want to say, first of all, I think you should take Gilles to a community board meeting in Staten Island. What do you think? I think it would go really well.
I would love it if you would go out there and argue for density on Staten Island.
There you go.
We would
I
appreciate
think we
it.
can harness this. So I think I'm here to sort of try to thread the needle or something, or find some connections. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that I could say about sort of the political constraints under which Carl and his colleagues operate. And I think, I will just say, I think mandatory inclusionary housing, I actually think it's potentially a tool to get more density into the city, because I think as difficult a time as Carl and Purnima and their staff and team is having at these community board meetings, it would be a lot harder if they weren't offering affordable housing. And so I think that's sort of part of the package. But that being said, I don't actually want to talk about the politics. I sort of want to, I'm sort of game for the challenge of actually trying to make an economic argument. So for why we might actually be justified as a city, that the city government might be justified in investing in affordable housing. This is obviously a hard case to make. Housing is expensive, Gilles, right? It's likely that people that receiving subsidies are going to wind up, unlikely they'd wind up with the same homes or the level of expenditures they would if you simply gave them cash, and that they would have chosen on their own. And so I think, the housing policies we adopt in the U.S. and in New York are likely second best policies. But I do think there are some reasonable economic arguments to make for affordable housing. And I think they generally fall into three categories. One is donor preferences for redistribution. Another is internalities of housing consumption. And a third is sort of a third big bucket. It relates to externalities. And I'd say that interesting, most of the discussion and debate about the justification and the rationale for housing subsidies really concerns spending by the federal government. And I think governments, I think the arguments are really somewhat different when we think about spending by a local government and by a city. And in some ways they're more favorable, and in some ways they're less favorable. And I think, again, the first justification for government intervention in housing markets really relates to sort of donor preferences and political support for in-kind subsidies rather than cash, right? So yes, it would be, in a first best world, we would be giving people more income, but there's all sorts of evidence, right, that we don't have the same political support for providing poor families, low-income families with income as we do with housing, okay? At a local level, though, it's hard to make that argument about redistribution, right? Public Econ 101 tells us that we shouldn't be redistributing income at a local level, that high-income households will simply move away. Now, I think the New York City mayor doesn't need to worry about this to the same extent as the mayors of other cities. There's, given the strong interest on the part of businesses and people to locate in New York City and enjoy the unique agglomerations here. But, he still needs to be sensitive to this threat. And so I don't think that the city should be leaning on redistribution as a chief rationale for for its housing policies. And in fact, I think that sort of if you look at the nature of New York's housing programs, they're not really, the nominal beneficiaries, right, and you talked about this, Gilles, right, the nominal beneficiaries of many of these cities' housing policies are not poor. Most of the poorest of the poor don't receive majority of these benefits. The city's programs tend to serve the near poor, moderate income, middle income households, and they probably, the city of New York probably targets sort of more of its dollars. I mean, it spends more. It also targets more of those dollars to moderate income and middle income households than other cities. You know, we could have 60,000 Mitchell-Lama apartments in New York that are aimed at middle and moderate income households. The subsidies in the plan target a range of households with a range of incomes, from very low income households up to households that are earning well above the city's median income, and the cities also invest in homeownership opportunities for middle-income households. So I think, I don't think that this is, the aim is really about redistribution. The second rationale for housing, government spending on housing, is really about sort of internalities, or the belief that individuals are not fully appreciating the benefit that they get from the consumption of housing, and maybe most important, that parents aren't appreciating the benefit that their children get from living in sound, stable housing, that it might help them to focus more in school, it might help them to grow up to be healthier. Admittedly, the empirical work on the magnitude of these benefits is limited. To be fair, it's not that there have been a lot of studies that haven't shown this. It's just that it's really difficult to demonstrate these, really difficult to identify these benefits empirically. So maybe they exist, maybe they don't. But what I really want to talk about is this third set of justifications, which I think center on externalities. And I think they're particularly important in cities, partially because of the density of cities, right? When we all live closer to each other, it means we bump into each other more, and it means that our behavior is more likely to affect other people. And plus, I think there's stronger externality arguments for cities investing in housing, because cities are going to capture the benefits, right, of those positive spillover benefits. And so what are these externalities arguments? So I think one is about income diversity as a public good, sort of more of a consumption good. The people of New York elected Mayor de Blasio, who ran on a platform of affordable housing, right? Polls and surveys consistently show that a majority of city residents and potential residents value the diversity of New York and worry that if rents keep rising, that New York's going to become that all but the rich will be priced out of the city. And I think, even the rich value diversity as a public good, is evidenced by their willingness to support scholarships for lower income students at private schools. And affordable housing may be essential to retaining the artists and performers, the writers who deliver the cultural vitality that we think is central to, that attracts residents to New York and thereby contributes to economic growth. So that's one. A second economic argument relates to the need for a diverse workforce, and on the production side. So in order to thrive and grow, right, businesses need a diversity of workers, and in order to have a diversity of workers, those workers in turn, right, need a range of affordable housing options. And there is considerable research showing, right, that large cities with more diverse economic activity and enjoy more robust economic growth. And again, in order to support that kind of diversity, you do need a range of housing options. And it's not clear that the market, I think, on its own would deliver that diversity, because individual firms may benefit more from clustering with like firms, and they may not fully internalize the benefits of having an ample supply of low and sort of moderate skilled workers. So, and interestingly, although I didn't hear it as much from you today, Carl, but if you look at sort of the rhetoric surrounding New York City's housing programs, and actually I wrote a paper with your colleague Dan O'Flaherty where we dug some of this up, that it really does center on a lot of the sort of official documents focus not on redistribution, but focus on these kind of externalities. So the mission of the housing, I wrote a few of these down, the mission of the Housing Development Corporation in New York says it seeks to increase the supply of multifamily housing, stimulate economic growth, and revitalize neighborhoods. Mayor Bloomberg Bloomberg's 2002 housing plan began by emphasizing production externalities in order for New York City to remain competitive and to ensure that its record growth can continue. Significant housing issues must be addressed. And finally, Mayor de Blasio, maybe Carl wrote this sentence, or maybe Vicky did, right, that it started with the need, motivated by the need to house the incredible and multidimensional talent pool that attracts employers and drives the city's economic growth. So it's a lot. They really hear the sort of economic growth argument. So a third argument relates to neighborhood externalities, particularly in distressed communities. That may be less relevant in today's market, but surely that, the existence of a dilapidated building with unkempt grounds, that may discourage other investment in a neighborhood. And I think that kind of neighborhood externality was key to motivating the Koch administration's plan, and you can see that in the rhetoric. And we have done some work down at NYU, downtown, documenting the existence of these spillovers and showing that investments in affordable housing could breathe new life into communities and repopulate streets and really sort of make a market. So a final externality argument relates to centers sort of on the role of economic diversity and integration in supporting economic mobility. So yes, there is maybe one really good paper that just came out. I think there's a little more. I would say there's a little more evidence than that, but I do think that paper is pretty persuasive that poor children growing up in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty are less likely to go to college. They're less likely to work. They earn lower earnings compared to children who have grown up in more economically diverse neighborhoods. And I think if New York, doesn't invest in affordable housing, that, we run the risk of that, of seeing much greater concentrations of poverty. So I think we can make an economic case for city investment in affordable housing, at least in this sort of second best world. And I do want to highlight also, although you did that a little bit too, that there's much to praise in this administration's approach, even from card-carrying economists. And I would actually argue that this administration, I think actually certainly this Department of City Planning is more pro-building than the Bloomberg administration. I think that you should be commending Carl and his colleagues for advocating the need for increasing the overall supply of housing and embracing density through rezoning and unlocking air rights, commending them for trying to reduce parking requirements, that's my favorite, and other regulatory barriers. They've tried hard to simplify terms, approval processes for new construction, improving coordination across agencies, and reducing bureaucratic delays. They've reinvested in critical infrastructure. So that said, I do, if I were czar, I would push the city in a few different directions. One is that, and I think you, Carl, would agree with me on this, but I know it's politically challenging, but property tax reform. We have an incredibly regressive system of property taxes. Rental housing is taxed much, much more highly than owner-occupied housing. And I think I'd love to see the city move, if not towards a pure land tax, at least to a split rate tax where land is taxed more heavily than improvements. This is on the, yes, politically this would be difficult, but it's not pie in the sky. There's 700 cities around the world that have such a split rate tax, and they have been shown to, encourage development because basically you get taxed the same whether you're sitting on a vacant lot or a 30-story apartment building. And I'd love to see the city relax regulations to allow for smaller housing units, such as SROs and micro units. If people want to trade off living in a 250, 300 square foot apartment in exchange for living in a more accessible location, I think they should be allowed to do so. I'd love to see the city relax occupancy codes to let people live in more crowded conditions if they want to. Again, if that's what the trade-off that they want to make, I think we should. And there really is no evidence that there are costs to that kind of crowding. And I would agree completely that we need to, make more investments in transportation in another way. That is another way to expand the supply of affordable housing in cities, right? Rather than just building up, you can, if you make those investments, you can build out. So I know there are political barriers, but I'd love to see the city push in some of those directions.
Carl has asked if he could make 5 factual points. I assume that's in contradiction to what's been said by our most recent speakers.
I'm going to hesitate and will not try to respond to the economists. I'm not an economist, but let me just clarify just a few factual questions or issues that, clearly when we're talking about the issue of vacant land, not density. And there's a real difference between the two. We don't have vacant land of any size of significance to build on, but we do agree that the city can become denser. The city has to become denser. And density is one very important goal for us, certainly in the neighborhoods that we are working in. Second, we have a goal not just to produce affordable housing, but to produce market rate housing as well. And we have a goal of 160,000 units of market rate housing over the next 10 years. Third, while I appreciate some of the immutable elements of economics, one thing I do think that will result from mandatory inclusionary zoning is that one element of what has been immutable or has been rising for many years will likely decline, and that is land costs. As we impose more requirements, land costs, which is an enormous part of the, as Gilles said, of housing costs, we believe will decline. Right now, it's not so much even the developers who are making the money, it's the landowners who are making the money, and hopefully land costs will decline. Fourth point, the whole major goal of mandatory inclusionary zoning is not to do bargaining, but to establish very, very clear, this is what you have to do. We have bargaining in the city now. It's unedifying. Each developer can come in and try to get its own deal. The whole idea of mandatory, or one idea of mandatory inclusionary zoning, is to eliminate bargaining so everything is predictable, every owner knows, or developer knows what it has to do. And then the final point is on wages. We certainly agree on the expenditure side. Housing is the most important expenditure and biggest expenditure a family has. But we know our economy is doing great, but a lot of people are earning the minimum wage. And if we only raise the minimum wage from what it is today to $15 an hour, which is what our goal is by 2019, that alone would take 800,000 people out of poverty. And that's an enormous goal, and independent of housing. And then the final 2 points I'd make is one in response to what Ingrid said. We have, as part of our zoning for quality and affordability, reduced the density factor so that people can live in smaller units. That is one of our goals. We do agree that's very important. And finally, we have to increasingly look beyond the city boundaries and look to the region for, as part of a dynamic marketplace. Increasingly, New York City residents are commuting to jobs outside New York City. Residents outside the city are commuting to jobs in New York. Both are increasing. Actually, the out commuting is increasing more. And, there is a need outside of New York City also to provide affordable housing, which is not being provided today, if we're going to achieve a healthy region.
Okay, I'm going to take the liberty to paraphrase, thank you, some of the questions that have been raised by various panelists and put them to each of them. So one concerns the mandatory inclusionary zoning. And so you do have to pause and wonder, well, how does the city get the power to mandate that the developers include 25 to 30% of their units as being something that's going to be paid not anywhere near market rates? So again, there's actually August of last year, Julie Satow did a story on, for example, somebody that is in a $3,200, I think it's called Chelsea Park studio apartment that they're renting for $540. And that's, that implicitly the gap there is a kind of tax on development. They could get $3,200, they're only getting $540. And you have to pause and think, is this something that we value at the gap between those, $2,700 per month. And I think that if I could paraphrase Gilles here, what we would, or maybe Enrico again sitting up front, is that implicitly, how is it that you're able to get them to do this? They would not do this on their own. They would be crazy in economic terms to do it. And the answer can only be that we are constraining supply, right? That we're putting a huge tax on the supply of units to these, and that one of the things, and again, you can do it in terms of the actual units being constructed. We're throwing big taxes on supplying these units. Guess what? You're going to get, and this was, I think, the Gilles' point, you're going to get less of them. Now, I think that there is an interesting question to be sort of sussed out there, which is less of what? Okay, and maybe it's less of high-end. Let me follow up on another one that Gilles did. I will sort of knock on each of you. I'm going to get you, Gilles. But another one is, so I think that one potential path back into that would be to say, well, yeah, but what's getting constructed anyway? It's these high-end apartments, and what's that going to do for the poor? So you construct a lot of high-end apartments. What's going to be great about that? And I think that there may be a couple of things to think about. One is, if you go to the East Village, you have people living in these minute apartments paying $1 and $2 million that formerly housed families from the shtetl. And so there's some serious crowding down, and it's at least worth thinking about whether things that crowd, the market as a whole, actually have some sort of, I'll call it not trickle down, but cram down effect, where the very inability to create any supply that that would house some of the upper income people ends up crowding into things that that would help the city as a whole. And one last thing on this, because these are going to be for Carl, is in some sense, again, one of the taxes that's included in mandatory inclusionary zoning is, in effect, it's an in-kind tax. If you thought people weren't getting enough food, then you're going around to the bagel shop and you're asking for some bagels, and the pizza shop, and you're going to everyone and you're asking in kind, because this is what you're supplying. So the things that are getting built, we're going to get in kind 25 to 30% of them. Now, that it may be that we need bagels and pizza, and then you look and you say, well, you know what? There are no new bagel and pizza shops. It's actually Danny Meyer and Jean-Georges Vongerichten that are opening up all the new ones. Well, let's get some of the meals that they serve, and we'll give them to the poor. And that's our food policy. And again, it's the point is not, absolutely not, that we don't want to do something about housing for the poor, but the question is whether this is a sensible policy way to achieve this. So again, at least one path, I'm not advocating this, but one path would be to tax them. If you add taxes, and you would have cash, and especially I worry about this at the point that we're actually giving huge tax credits to maintain affordable housing. And that's money that could be used either directly to build housing in places that are appropriate and of the kinds of units that are appropriate, or there are also things, one of the other things, the crisis of affordability is not only about the price of housing, it's also about incomes. And incomes, you can think short and you can think long term. It was hurt by the financial crisis. Incomes in recent years is actually the bigger piece of the affordability crisis. And shouldn't we be taking those dollars that we're using to invest in giving developers extra money in order to maintain affordable apartments? Is that really the best use of that money, or should we be fixing our public schools? Or there are other things that we should be investing in workforce development? So I'll give you a chance to answer, and then I'll attack the rest of the people.
Well, that's quite a question. So I'm not an economist, but I am a lawyer, so I'm going to talk on, I am going to go on more familiar grounds. So the whole idea and the legal basis for mandatory inclusionary zoning is not as a tax, but as a land use matter. And one of the reasons that we stress that diverse neighborhoods is important is because that's really the basis on which we're doing this. We're doing this as a land use matter. We believe diverse neighborhoods are important in the city of New York, and virtually anything that one does through zoning is a constraint on what a property owner can do. So if we, as in many neighborhoods that are resisting our parking requirements or resisting increased density, if we've imposed height limits in the past on those neighborhoods, which those neighborhoods are very, very happy with, and those are middle class neighborhoods and upper middle class neighborhoods, that's a tax on developers as well. That's even and one could argue a less productive tax in a social sense. And so the basis of this is zoning and land use, not economics and tax. But that, as a constitutional matter, has been upheld, and most recently, similar arrangement has been upheld by the Supreme Court in California, and we're very confident that it will be upheld here, not as an exaction, but as a perfectly rational land use system. And in fact, in deploying this, we did it in a way that we did a major economic study, engaged a serious economic firm to assure us that, in fact, that there was significant remaining profit for developers that would not significantly reduce their incentive to produce. So that's fundamental. The second, I think, issue that you raised is regarding tax credits. And yes, New York City makes extensive use of tax credits for development, and that is also an element of providing affordable housing, where we now insist on, and will insist going forward now under state law, 25 to 30% affordability in return for a tax subsidy. With respect to the other points that you're raising, how we spend our public dollars, I think that's a fair question, and that's one of the reasons why we at City Planning believe it's so important for planning to be now engaged and involved as part of the allocation of city tax dollars. How much should go to schools? How much should go to infrastructure? How much should go to transportation? How much should go to police stations? How much should go to housing? Is, of course, the very essence of democracy and what we as planners have to allocate. We're allocating a lot, $7.2 billion, as I said, for affordable housing, but that's less than 1/10 of the city's 10-year capital program. We just provided, as many of you may know, $2.5 billion to the next MTA capital program. That's much, much more than the city has provided in the past. So yes, how we allocate our tax dollars, I think, and our capital dollars is really important. And I do want to go back to one of the points that Ingrid made earlier, because that was my sentence on with respect to the importance of this in terms of attracting the kind of talent we need. This is an economic development issue as well as a social equity issue. And the reason it's an economic development issue is because New York, more than any other city in the United States, is a city that is the whole thrust, and it always has been in my lifetime, the whole thrust of New York City is that we do best when we grow. We do best when we are a city of opportunity. And if we're a city of opportunity, if we grow, and if our economy is strong, we will have the kinds of resources that we can devote to these kinds of social requirements and demands as a society. And if we don't have those resources, if we don't grow, we won't have those resources. So fundamentally, the two are very related. We have to assure ourselves that we can attract the young talent, the high quality talent, the diverse talent that makes the city such an economic powerhouse, so that we have the resources to do the kinds of social commitments we think are important.
So this is a
Can I
question.
just jump in on one point on that?
Yeah.
The one thing I think that I don't think you said, Carl, was that I mean the mandatory inclusionary housing is really it's only being implemented in areas that are getting rezoned. So it's really essentially coming together with an upzoning, right?
That's
so
correct.
so that's
I did
actually
say, right. I did say actually it is associated with any area that we are increasing housing capacity,
Right.
whether through a rezoning in an area or whether through a private application where an owner comes in and says, I think I should be able to change my land use from manufacturing
That's right.
to housing and get a tremendous benefit.
That's right.
Well, of course they should be.
they should be, you're just taking back some of that benefit.
Right. Now,
So-
ultimately, our goal, our hope is that the entire city will and may have to have an increase in housing capacity. And so over time, mandatory inclusionary housing will become more ubiquitous.
Okay, let me ask a question for Gilles. Okay, so I know that you're not against all zoning, but I'm guessing that in terms of housing, that if we had to put you in a corner, it would be closer to laissez-faire. So I'll just take that as a premise. So one thing that's not in our models is that the people living in these houses are human. Okay, there are economists here, so I don't want to be too far out. But what I mean by this is that is in some sense that cities are people living together, and that we worry about, so one could go through some of the recent things, Ferguson or these kinds of things, but one could think more broadly that not the only thing by far, but one of the things that took down cities in the 1960s and 1970s was our inability to live together. Okay, was segregation and conflict and so on. And the question is whether, if we move towards a real laissez-faire society, we're going to find dramatically higher levels of economic, social, ethnic, and racial segregation. And if that is the path that we would take, if we went towards a more strongly laissez-faire system on housing, is that something that a city should tolerate?
Well, I think my concern is whether we should actually devote large resources for people above the median and transfer lots of resources to them between the median and whatever the eights will decide, and actually make them large gifts and lots of policy efforts in favor of those guys, or we should try to provide the best possible living conditions to people at the very bottom two deciles. And to me, the choice is really, really clear. I would very much prefer things to be in favor of the bottom two deciles, way more than inclusionary zoning, which I think is not talking about that at all. So this is where the concerns are. At the same time, I think it's a hard problem because we don't know how to do that well. We've tried to do public housing, and it's not working well. It's not working well in this country. It's certainly not working well in my country. But this is where I think the effort and the energies should be focused. The aesthetic issues of having people living more together or less together, I think is somewhat secondary. And again, the distribution of income in New York City as a whole is not that far off relative to the rest of the country.
Okay, so let me give one, just to make everything very even-handed, one question for Ingrid, which is ultimately, right, we're spending public resources. And as Carl pointed out, there are lots of things that are dire needs in the city. And I gave the one example of Chelsea Park, where you have, it wouldn't be extraordinary that the rent that's being paid is some large multiple, that the market rent is some large multiple of the rent that's being paid. And so it does seem to me that if you're in favor of these kind of policies, it is incumbent not only to say that there's some social benefit associated with having people there. I would like to live in Chelsea. Sorry, John. But the question, there's a very serious question whether the social benefits that we're looking at are anywhere near of the same magnitude as the costs that are being imposed.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good question. I would say, you have to ask, how many, even if you're talking about, if you're saying we're going to spend subsidy dollars on affordable housing, then the question is, how many units in a low-income neighborhood would you be willing to trade for sort of one unit in a higher-income neighborhood? And I think that answer is, for most of us in the room, probably greater than one. Is it 5? I mean, I think it's a hard question. So I have been persuaded in reading this literature that, there are some benefits and that ratio should be more than 1, but I think that it is hard to justify the very large differences in costs that often occur. I mean, and that's more true. I mean, I'm looking at the sort of the gradient of land rents is sort of higher in New York and in higher cost, more constrained cities, so that you see those differentials are higher. So.
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to get to some of the questions that came in from the audience, and I hope I'll just let whoever wants to speak to it. So one of them is, what role do you believe that universities in the city, NYU and Columbia in particular, currently have or should have in creating or prohibiting affordable housing? And if you'd like, so that's one, if you want to talk about the broader role that universities should be playing in affecting the city, interacting with the city, things that it could be doing that it's not, I'd be happy to have you speak to that as well.
You want to talk about that?
Well, I'll just start. I mean, you can hear from this discussion among us that there are many assumptions that we make, and that that perhaps and disagreements about what the impacts of what we're doing will be, where social research is just enormously important, and we have issues every day which we ask ourselves, what is going to be the impact of what we're doing? Just thinking of the last question that you asked Ingrid. I mean, we struggle all the time with the question of how do you balance the goal of economic integration in neighborhoods with the reality that you are going to produce fewer affordable housing units in expensive neighborhoods than you would produce if those housing units were in less expensive neighborhoods. And what is the trade-offs involved in that? That's enormously important. And really, we depend on, just using Furman Center as one example, we really depend on the unbiased research that universities do. Government, sadly, I guess, like the media, is just viewed very cynically by the public, and universities aren't, at least not yet, and hopefully that will continue. But I really do believe that that's a very important role. And then beyond that, of course, I don't have to tell anyone in this room that universities and really world-class universities are a central part of the city's economic and social tapestry, and it's hard to imagine a major urban center without thriving world-class intellectual centers, and we're fortunate to have those here.
I was going to just say one thing on that. I mean, and I don't want to make it sound self-serving, but I think there's sort of 3 things in this area that universities can do. I mean, one, as that Carl said, is that I think we can continue to really push ourselves to produce relevant research that not only pushes sort of the academic envelope, but also really is useful to for policymakers. Number 2, I think we actually can be a place that a forum for debates like this that can be very difficult. I mean, I'm sure that discussions you're having at community board meetings are very reasonable and rational. But sometimes, I think that we can be kind of a safer space where you can have the time, I hope, for reflection. And then finally, and probably most importantly, we're training students. I hope we're training the students that you're going to hire. So
We do.
Yes.
So,
Let me add just one thing, because both Columbia and NYU, and I was earlier this afternoon at the new school, and there are lots of great institutions, great university institutions in New York. At the same time, here you don't really perceive the importance of those places. Again, in Philadelphia, the Penn-Drexel complex, if we fail, I think the whole city will fail. And if we're talking about Baltimore and Johns Hopkins, that's the same story. So for lots of those places, the opportunities and the development brought by universities, not people like me, but actually people doing like real science and people who invent with the future, if we don't succeed, that's a really, really big problem for the cities. New York is blessed by not having that sort of difficulties. Indeed, it has an issue with affordable housing, but probably it's a good problem to have.
So let me apologize. We're going to be ending with this. I really want to thank all of you for coming in and being here tonight. I want to thank Gilles and Ingrid for being sort of the academic side of this, and I especially want to thank Carl for taking time, to come and it's a different perspective that I know that personally I don't have as much access to as I would want to, and I'm hoping it's just, I know that he's been at Columbia before. He used to teach here in the architecture school. But I hope that for him and for others in the city government, that this is just the beginning. And I'm really, really happy. So thank you all. No, I really